All right, great, thank you. It's amazing to see so many people out here tonight. Thank you all for coming. Your participation has well surpassed our expectations. So this speaks well to the types of issues that Glen's book raises and how engaged our community here is in those. So thank you for coming. My name is Jessica Evans, and I'm a member of the Historical Materialism Toronto Organizing Committee. And just before we get going, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that we're meeting here today on Anishinaabe territory. So as many of you might have seen from our Facebook event page, there's been a bit of a change in our schedule. We had expected Lee Miracle to be here as a discussant, but unfortunately she had to cancel last minute due to some personal obligations. So the format then is going to change a little bit. We're going to give Glen a little bit more time to speak. So Glen's probably going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll follow this up with discussion for about 40 minutes or so. Afterwards, you're welcome and invited to join us for drinks at the Poppers Pub. We've reserved some tables, so you can just let them know that you're there for the book launch, and that is at 539 Bloor Street. We have books on sale at the back. They were incredibly difficult to obtain because this book is selling out like crazy. But Another Story Books has managed to obtain about 30 or 40 copies. Those are on sale at the back for $30 inclusive, and you can pay cash or card or any of those kinds of things. So we have here Glen Coulthard. So I hope you join me in welcoming him. Glen is a member of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation, and he's an activist and academic, currently assistant professor in First Nation Studies, as well as the Department of Political Science at the University of British Columbia. So Glen has published several articles and book chapters in the areas of Indigenous thought and politics, and is currently working on a new project which seeks to critically engage issues of settler political economy. So we're going to celebrate the launch of Glen's book, Red Skin, White Masks, Rejecting the Colonial Politics of Recognition. And rather than saying anything to that, I think I'll just let Glen kind of dive into that.
Thank you for inviting me. This is always a humbling experience. This is about the third time that I've done this now for this work. And I'm always blown away by how kind people are and the reception of it. So thanks to Jessica and the other members of Historical Materialism Toronto for being so kind and setting me up here. Also thanks to the space. It's a very lovely space, and I look forward to spending some time here today. I haven't really figured out how to do this well yet, so sometimes I'm just thinking I should probably talk about the book. Sometimes people want me to read from it, so I'm kind of going to do a little bit of both. What I'm going to talk to you today is based off of some of the conclusions that I arrive at in the text, and so it does a fairly decent job, I think, of setting up the argument that I make, and then when I dream in colors a little bit on what I think our anti-colonial efforts ought to encapsulate. So I'll just work through this, and then we can open it up to a conversation. So in writing the book, I set out essentially to problematize what I think is an increasingly commonplace but profoundly misplaced assumption that the colonial relationship between Indigenous nations and the Canadian state can be reconciled by a liberal politics of recognition. So I characterize the politics of recognition as a recognition-based approach to reconciling Indigenous peoples' assertions of nationhood with settler state sovereignty via the accommodation of Indigenous identity-related demands through the negotiations of settlements over issues such as land, economic development, and self-government. I argue that this orientation to the reconciliation of Indigenous nationhood with state sovereignty is still colonial insofar as it remains structurally committed to the dispossession of our peoples of our lands and of our self-determining authority. In short, I argue that settler colonization is a structure of domination that is maintained through forced fraud and manufactured consent, which has as its telos the theft of Indigenous land for the purposes of state formation, settlement, and ongoing capitalist accumulation. So my conceptualization of settler colonization as a structure of domination predicated on our dispossession drew significantly from two theoretical resources: Karl Marx's writings on the primitive accumulation of capital, and Frantz Fanon's decolonial critique of Hegel's master-slave dialectic when applied to colonial situations. With respect to Marx, I claim that chapters 26 through 33 of his first volume of Capital are crucial, because it's there that Marx most thoroughly links the totalizing power of capital with that of colonialism by way of his theory of primitive accumulation. Challenging the idyllic portrayal of capitalism's origins by bourgeois economists like Adam Smith, Marx's chapters on primitive accumulation highlight the incredibly gruesome and violent nature of the transition from feudal to capitalist social relations in Western Europe, and of course focusing much of his attention on England. Marx's historical excavation of the birth of the capitalist mode of production identifies a host of colonial-like state practices which serve to violently strip, in his words, through conquest and slavery, robbery and murder, non-capitalist producers, communities, and societies from their means of production and subsistence. So in Capital, these formative acts of dispossession set the stage for the emergence of capitalist accumulation and the reproduction of capitalist relations of production by tearing indigenous societies, peasants, and other small-scale, self-sufficient agricultural producers from the source of their livelihood, in this case, literally the land under our feet. It was this horrific process that established the two necessary preconditions underwriting capitalism itself. It forcefully opened up what were once collectively held territories and resources to privatization and enclosure, which over time came to produce a class of workers compelled to enter into the exploitative realm of the labor market for their survival. In this sense, we can read primitive accumulation as a historical process that refers to the violent transformation of non-capitalist forms of life into capitalist ones. Now, as insightful as Marx's primitive accumulation thesis is, however, I draw on indigenous traditions of political thought and critique to argue that three issues must be addressed within his work to make his writings on colonialism relevant to analyzing the relationship between our peoples and liberal settler states like Canada. First, I argue that Marx's thesis on primitive accumulation must be stripped of its rigidly temporal character. In other words, rather than positing primitive accumulation as some historically situated inaugural set of events that set the stage for the development of the capitalist mode of production through colonial expansion, we should see it as an ongoing practice of dispossession that never ceases to structure capitalist and colonial social relationships in the present. Settler colonization is territorially acquisitive in perpetuity. Second, I argue that Marx's theory of primitive accumulation must be stripped of its early normative developmentalist character. While it's correct to view primitive accumulation as a condition of possibility for the development and ongoing reproduction of capitalist social relations, it is incorrect to view it as a necessary condition for the developing of forms of critical consciousness and assorted or associated modes of life that ought to inform the construction of alternatives to capitalism in settler colonial contexts. I also suggested that Marx himself came to acknowledge, it's now being acknowledged more, that this problematic character of his early formulation he worked to correct towards the ends of his life. And finally, I argue that the forms of colonial power associated with primitive accumulation need not be understood as strictly coercive, repressive, or explicitly violent in nature. Rather, the practices of dispossession central to the maintenance of settler colonialism in liberal democratic contexts like Canada rely on as much on the productive character of colonial power than it does on the coercive authority of the settler state. Seen from this angle, settler colonialism should not be seen as deriving its reproductive force solely through its strictly repressive and violent features, although these will always exist simultaneously, but rather from its ability to produce forms of life that render settler colonialism's constitutive hierarchies seem endurable or even natural. Settler colonization thus functions as a form of governmentality, as a relatively diffuse set of governing relations that operate through a circumscribed mode of recognition that structurally ensures continued access to indigenous peoples' lands and resources by producing neo-colonial identities or subjectivities that co-opt us into becoming instruments of our own dispossession. Contemporary colonialism works through rather than entirely against freedom. Now, to tease out the productive character of settler colonial power, I turn to the theoretical contribution of the late great anti-colonial psychiatrist and revolutionary Frantz Fanon. I use Fanon's work because it implicates the role played by recognition in the reproduction of settler colonial forms of rule in a manner that still resonates profoundly today. More specifically, I use Fanon's critical engagement with the dialectic of recognition theorized in Hegel's master-slave narrative in the phenomenology of spirit to identify the neo-colonial function played by contemporary recognition politics in maintaining the settler-colonial relationship between Indigenous nations and the Canadian state. I drew three insights from Fanon in particular. First, I claim that Fanon's critique of Hegel's theory of recognition convincingly unpacks the ways in which delegated exchanges of political recognition negotiated between the colonizer and the colonized usually ends up being structurally determined by and in the interests of the colonizer. Second, Fanon also identifies the subtle ways in which colonized populations often come to develop what he calls psychoaffective attachments to these master-sanctioned forms of delegated recognition. And it's these psychoaffective attachments that create the impression of naturalness to the colonial situation itself, which he referred to as internalization or internalized colonialism. And third, Fanon showed how colonized populations, despite the totalizing intent of colonialism, are often able to turn away from these internalized forms of colonial recognition, and in doing so transform colonialism's inculcation of inferiority into expressions of indigenous native self-empowerment through the critical reclamation and revitalization of pre-colonial social relations and cultural traditions. In the end, however, I show how Fanon viewed these practices of indigenous cultural self-empowerment or self-recognition as insufficient for decolonization. They constitute a means, but not an end, to use his comrade Jean-Paul Sartre's well-known formulation. And finally, then, to conclude my analysis, I turn our attention to the contributions that Indigenous scholars and activists, particularly but not necessarily limited to those working within the framework of Indigenous resurgence, have added to our understanding of the entanglement of contemporary recognition politics with the operation of settler colonial power, focusing specifically on the work of Mohawk scholar Diag Alfred and Anishinaabe feminist Leanne Simpson. I felt that it was important to conclude my study in this way because Indigenous contributions to anti-colonial thought and practice have generally been underappreciated for their transformative value and theoretical acumen. Indeed, even Fanon viewed the decolonial potential of Indigenous cultural politics as fundamentally undercut by the resentment-laden orientation towards the past. We should not therefore be content to delve into a people's past to find concrete examples to counter colonialism's endeavor to distort or depreciate, writes Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth. Colonialism will never be put to shame by exhibiting unknown cultural treasures under its nose. I suggest that it's at this point that we reach a limit to Fanon's decolonial analysis, at least when applied to the settler-colonial dynamics that inform our current circumstances. Although Fanon importantly eschews an evolutionary anthropological theory of historical development, in which societies are viewed as developing along a linear path from primitive to civilized, he nonetheless remained to a dialectical conception of social transformation that privileges the old or the new over the old. When this dialectic is applied to colonial situations, I suggest that the result is a conceptualization of culture that mimics how many Marxists understand class, as a transitional category of identification that colonized peoples must struggle to transcend as soon as they become conscious of its existence as a distinct form of identification. This view simply does not provide much insight into either what motivates Indigenous resistance to settler colonialism or into the cultural foundations upon which a decolonial alternative might be imagined and indeed constructed. Culture is a substantive, not instrumental consideration in our struggles for land and freedom. Culture is not, to quote Diag Alfred, instrumental to the surging against colonial power. It is the very means of our struggle. So now I want to turn to some areas where I think future research can happen, and I form them in the form of a number of theses. So the first one I want to speak about is on direct action. Now I'm going to structure my comments on direct action around a problematic restraint that is increasingly being placed on Indigenous activism that aspires to transform the colonial relationship between our societies and those of settler people. This constraint involves the types of tactics that are being represented as morally legitimate in our efforts to defend our land and our rights, on the one hand, and those that are increasingly being presented as either morally illegitimate or at least politically self-defeating because of their disruptive, extra-legal, and therefore potentially alienating character on the other. With respect to those approaches deemed legitimate in defending our rights, emphasis is usually placed on formal negotiations, usually carried out between official Aboriginal leadership and representatives of the state, and if need be, coupled with largely symbolic acts of peaceful, non-destructive protest that has to abide by Canada's, quote, rule of law. Those approaches that are increasingly deemed illegitimate include, but are not limited to, forms of direct action that seek to influence power in less mediated and sometimes more disruptive and confrontational measures. In the context of Indigenous peoples' struggles, the forms of direct action often taken to be problematic include activities like temporarily blocking access to Indigenous territories with the aim of impeding the exploitation of Indigenous peoples' land and resources, or in rare cases still the more or less permanent reoccupation of portions of native land through the establishment of a reclamation site which also serves to disrupt, if not entirely block, access to Indigenous peoples' territories by state and capital for sustained periods of time. Now, regardless of the diversity and specificity of these actions, most of the approaches mentioned here tend to get branded in the media as typical native blockade, militant, threatening, disruptive, and violent. Now, there are three arguments that typically get used when critics rail against the use of more assertive and disruptive forms of Indigenous direct action. The first is that negotiations, we are repeatedly told of ad nauseum, are objectively speaking simply more effective in securing the rights and advancing the interests of Indigenous people and communities. This is simply a lie. Historically, I would venture to suggest that all negotiations over the scope and content of Indigenous people's rights in the last 40 years have piggybacked off of the assertive direct action spearheaded by Indigenous women and other grassroots elements of our community. For example, there would likely have been no negotiations over Aboriginal rights and title in British Columbia through the current land claims process, as shitty as it is, if it were not for the ongoing commitment of Indigenous activists willing to put their bodies on the line in defense of their lands and communities. There would likely have been no Royal Commission on the Aboriginal peoples, as insufficient as its recommendations are, without the land-based direct actions that proliferated across Canada throughout the 1980s and 90s, which saw Indigenous peoples putting themselves directly in harm's way, armed if necessary, in defense of their lands and distinct ways of life. Likewise, there would not likely have been pressure to establish a national inquiry into the 1,200 plus murdered and missing women and girls in Vancouver and across the country if it were not for the thousands of Native women and their allies who have formed lasting networks of mutual care and support and taken to the streets every year on February 14th for more than 2 decades to ensure that state-sanctioned sexual violence against Indigenous women ends here and now. All of this is to say, if there has been any progress in securing our rights to land and life, including through the largely male-dominated world of formal negotiations, this progress is owed to the committed activists practicing their obligations to the land and to each other in this diverse networks of and communities of struggle. The second argument that gets used to denounce or criticize more disruptive forms of direct action involve these actions' supposedly self-defeating or alienating character. The idea this time is that insofar as these tactics disrupt the lives of perhaps well-intentioned but equally uninformed non-Indigenous people, First Nations will increasingly find themselves alienated and are causes unsupported by average working-class Canadians. Now, I have 2 brief points to make on this one. First, I think that getting this reaction from the dominant society is unavoidable. Indigenous peoples have within our sights a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between Indigenous nations and Canada. For more than 2 centuries, this relationship has run roughshod over the rights of Indigenous peoples, which has resulted in a massive stockpiling of power and privilege by the dominant society. Land has been stolen, and simply stated, significant amounts of it will have to be returned. Power and authority have been unjustly appropriated, and much of it will have to be reinstated. This will inevitably be very upsetting to some. It will be very inconvenient to others, but is what needs to happen if we are to create a more just and sustainable life for the bulk of Indigenous communities, and I would argue for the majority of non-Indigenous people as well. Now, my second point is that this criticism is also just straight up racist. I suspect that equally disruptive direct actions undertaken by various sectors of, for example, the mainstream labor movement, including job actions ranging from the withdrawal of teaching, transit, and healthcare services to full-blown strike activity, does not undergo the same criticism and scrutiny by progressive non-natives that Indigenous peoples' movements are subject to. When these sectors of society defend their rights outside of the increasingly hostile confines of imposed labor legislation, actions that also tend to disproportionately disrupt the lives of ordinary Canadians, it is crucial that we educate ourselves about the causes that inform these efforts. I would suggest that all Indigenous peoples ask is that the same courtesy and respect be offered our communities in our justice struggles. Now, the third critique involves what we might characterize as a neo-Nietzschean concern over the largely reactive stance that such acts of resistance take in practice. On the surface, blockades in particular appear to be the epitome of reaction insofar as they clearly embody a resounding no, but fail to offer a more affirmative gesture or alternative built into the practice itself. The risk here is that in doing so, these ressentiment-laden expressions of Indigenous resistance reify the structures and social relationships that we find so abhorrent. In Nietzsche's terms, insofar as this no becomes our creative deed, we end up dependent on the hostile world that we have come to define ourselves against. We become dependent on, quote, external stimuli to act at all. Our action is fundamentally one of reaction. This concern is premised on a misunderstanding of what these forms of direct action are all about. In his own creative engagement with Nietzsche at the end of Black Skin, White Masks, Frantz Fanon explains that yes, man is an affirmation, and that we shall not stop repeating it. Yes to life, yes to love, yes to generosity. But man, he continues on to crucially insist, is also a negation. No to man's contempt, no to the indignity of man, to the exploitation of man, to the massacre of what is most human, freedom, or in man, freedom. It is through explicitly disruptive oppositional practices that Indigenous peoples physically say no to the degradation of our communities and to the exploitation of the lands upon which we all now depend. But these practices also have ingrained within them, a resounding yes. They are the affirmative enactment of another mode of being, a different way of relating to and with the world. And in the case of blockades like the one erected by the Anishinaabe people of Grassy Narrows in northwestern Ontario, which has been in existence since 2002, they literally become another way of life, another form of community. They embody through praxis our ancestral obligations to protect the lands that are core to who we are as Indigenous people. Thesis 2, Capitalism No More. What the recent direct actions of First Nations communities against the proliferation of oil pipelines and liquefied natural gas exploration demonstrate is that Indigenous forms of economic disruption through the use of blockades are both a negation but also an affirmation. They are a crucial act of negation because they seek to impede or block flow of resources currently being transported to international markets from oil and gas fields, refineries, lumber mills, mining operations, and hydroelectric facilities located on the dispossessed lands of our nations. These modes of direct action, in other words, seek to have a negative impact on the economic infrastructure that is core to colonial accumulation or the colonial accumulation of capital in settler economies like Canada's. Blocking access to this critical infrastructure has historically been quite effective in forging short-term gains for Indigenous peoples. However, state and corporate powers have also become quite skilled at recuperating the losses incurred as a result of Indigenous peoples' resistance by drawing our leaders off the land and back into negotiations where the terms are always set by and in the interest of settler capital. What tends to get ignored by many commentators is that these actions are also an affirmative gesture of Indigenous resurgence insofar as they embody an enactment of Indigenous law and the obligation such laws place on Indigenous peoples to uphold the relations of reciprocity that shape our engagements with the human and other hidden human world, i.e. the land. The question I want to just explore briefly here is how might we move beyond a resurgent Indigenous politics that seeks to inhibit the destructive effects of capital to one that strives to create alternatives to it. Stated quite clearly, without a massive transformation in the political economy of contemporary settler colonialism, any effort to rebuild our nations will remain parasitic on capitalism and therefore on the perpetual exploitation of our lands and labor. Consider, for an example, an approach to resurgence that would see Indigenous nations begin to reconnect with their lands and land-based practices on either an individual or small-scale collective level. This could take the form of walking the land, as in the case with the Dene, in an effort to refamiliarize ourselves with the landscapes and places that give our histories, languages, and cultures shape and content. To revitalizing and engaging in land-based harvesting practices like hunting, fishing, gathering, and/or cultural production activities like hide tanning and carving, all of which also serve to assert our sovereign presence on our territories in ways that can be profoundly pedagogical and educating, and even empowering, to the reoccupation of sacred spaces for the purposes of relearning and practicing our ceremonial activities. A similar problem informs self-determination efforts that seeks to curtail our poverty and economic dependency through resource revenue sharing, more comprehensive impact benefit agreements, and affirmative action and employment strategies negotiated with the state and with industries currently tearing up our communities and territories. Even though the capital generated by such an approach could in theory be spent subsidizing the revitalization of certain cultural traditions and practices, in the end, like the previous example, they would still remain dependent on a predatory economy that is entirely at odds with the deep reciprocity that forms the cultural core of Indigenous peoples' relationships to and with land. What forms might an Indigenous political economic alternative to the intensification of capitalism on and within our territories take? For some communities, reinvigorating a mix of subsistence-based activities with more contemporary economic ventures might be one alternative. As I discuss in Chapter 2 of the book, in the 1970s, the Dene Nation sought to curtail the negative environmental and cultural impacts of capitalist extractivism by proposing to establish an economy that would apply traditional concepts of Dene governance, decentralized regional political structures based on participatory consensus decision-making to the realm of the economy. At the time, this would have seen the revitalization of a bush mode of production with emphasis placed on the harvesting and manufacturing of local renewable resources through traditional activities like hunting, fishing, and trapping, potentially combined with and partially subsidized by other economic activities on lands communally held and managed by the Dene Nation. Economic models discussed during this time thus included the democratic organization of production and distribution through Indigenous cooperatives and worker-owned and managed enterprise because it was seen as being more attuned to Dene culture. Revisiting Indigenous political economic alternatives such as these could pose a real threat to the accumulation of capital in at least three ways. First, through mentorship and education, these economies reconnect Indigenous peoples to land-based practices and forms of knowing and knowledge that emphasize radical sustainability. This form of grounded normativity is antithetical to capitalist accumulation in the long term. Second, these economic practices offer a means of subsistence that over time can help break our dependence on the capitalist market by cultivating self-sufficiency through the localized and sustainable production of core foods and life materials that we distribute and consume within our own communities on a regular basis. And third, through the application of Indigenous governance principles to non-traditional economic activities, we open up a way of engaging in contemporary economic adventures in an Indigenous way that is better suited to foster sustainable economic decision-making and equitable distribution of resources within and between Indigenous communities, Native women's political and economic emancipation, and empowerment for Indigenous citizens and workers who may pursue livelihoods in sectors outside of the bush. The capacity of Indigenous economies to challenge the hegemony of settler colonial capital, however, can only happen if certain conditions are met. In particular, all of the colonial, racist, patriarchal, and political obstacles that have been used to block our access to land need to be confronted and destroyed. Of course, capitalism continues to play a core role in dispossessing us of our lands and self-determining capacities, but it only does so with the aid of other forms of exploitation and domination configured along racial, gender, and state lines. Dismantling all of these oppressive structures will not be easy. It will require that we continue to assert our presence on all of our territories, coupled with an escalation of the confrontations with the forces of colonization through forms of direct action and organizing that are currently being undertaken by Indigenous communities across the country. Thesis 3, whose streets are streets? Indigenous sovereignty in the city. So in Canada, more than half of Indigenous peoples now live in urban centres. The relationship between Indigenous peoples and the city, however, has always been one fraught with tension. Historically, Canadian cities were originally conceived of as, in the colonial imagination, as explicitly non-native spaces. As civilized spaces, and urban planners and Indian policymakers went through great efforts to expunge urban centres of Indigenous presence. In 1911, for example, Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier announced in Parliament that if there were a reserve, quote, in the vicinity of a growing town, as is the case in several places, it becomes a source of nuisance and an impediment to progress. This developmentalist rationale, which at the time conceived of native space, particularly reserve as uncultivated wastelands, justified an amendment to the Indian Act a month later, which stipulated that the residents of any, quote, Indian reserve which adjoins or is situated wholly or partly within an incorporated town having a population of not less than 8,000 could be legally removed from their present location without their consent if it was deemed in the best interest of the public and of the Indians of the band whose use the reserve is held. This situated, I would argue, Indian policy in quite a precarious position, as by the turn of the 19th century, the reserve system, originally implemented to isolate and marginalize Native peoples for the purposes of social engineering, i.e. assimilation and genocide, was increasingly being seen as a failure because of the geographical distance of reserves from the civilizational influence of cities. Here you have the economic imperatives of capitalist accumulation through dispossession of Indigenous peoples' land and the rounding up of us onto reserve, come into sharp confrontation with the white supremacist impulses of Canada's assimilation policy and the desire by settler society to claim the city for themselves and only themselves. This civilizational discourse that rationalized both the theft of Indigenous peoples' land base and their subsequent confinement onto reserves facilitated a significant geographical separation of the colonizer and the colonized that lasted well into the mid-20th century. As Shireen Razak notes, the segregation of urban from native space that marked the colonial era began to break down with the increase in urbanization that took hold in the 1950s and 60s, which resulted in a new racial configuration of space now within the city. The dispossession that originally displaced Indigenous peoples from their traditional territories, either onto reserves or disproportionately into inner cities of Canada's major urban centres, is now serving to displace Indigenous populations from the urban spaces we have increasingly come to call home. To this end, I suggest that the analytical frame of settler colonialism developed throughout my book offers an important lens through which to interrogate the power relationships that shape Indigenous experiences in the city, especially those disproportionately inhabiting low-income areas. Defenders of settler colonial power have tended to rationalize these practices by treating the lands in question as terra nullius, that racist legal fiction that declared Indigenous peoples too primitive to bear rights to land and sovereignty when we first encountered European powers on the continent, thus rendering our territories legally empty and therefore open for colonial settlement and development. In the inner cities of Vancouver, Edmonton, Winnipeg, and of course Toronto, we are seeing a similar logic govern the gentrification and subsequent dispossession and displacement of Indigenous peoples from native spaces within the city. Commonly defined as the transformation of working class areas of the city into middle class residential and or commercial spaces, gentrification is also shown to be structurally prone to dispossession and displacement, specifically of poor, racialized, Indigenous, and other marginalized segments of the urban population. In spite of these negative effects, however, gentrifiers often defend their projects as a form of improvement, through which previously wasted land property, and lives are made more socially and economically productive. This Lockean rationale has led some scholars to view gentrification through a colonial lens, as yet another frontier of dispossession central to the accumulation of capital. To my mind, such a perspective is crucial insofar as it highlights not only the class composition of urban development and displacement, but also the manner in which colonial ideologies of race and gender converge with class in a structural process geared towards the acquisition of lands and resources previously under the care and authority of indigenous nations. As urban geographers Nicholas Blomley and Jeff Sumner's note, like the representational practices that originally served to render much of North America legally vacant and therefore up for grabs by white power, the new urban frontiers of places like Vancouver's downtown east side, in the city where I live and work, are increasingly presented as, quote, wild, dangerous, and ultimately empty spaces ripe for resettlement. Through gentrification, native spaces in the city are now being treated as urbs nullius, urban space void of indigenous sovereign presence. Coming to grips with, and addressing this structural congruency between indigenous land-based and urban struggles must be central to any decolonization that is worth the name. Thesis 4, on the necessity of gender justice and decolonization. The violence that women face indigenous women face is both systemic and symbolic. It is systemic in the sense that it's been structured, indeed institutionalized into a relatively secure and resistant set of oppressive material relationships that render indigenous women more likely than their non-indigenous counterparts to suffer severe economic and social privation. Just as importantly, however, the violence that indigenous women face is also symbolic in the sense that Pierre Bourdieu used the term, quote, gentle and visible violence, unrecognized as such, chosen as much as undergone. Symbolic violence, in other words, is a subjectifying form of violence that renders the crushing materiality of systemic violence invisible, appear natural, even acceptable. The symbolic violence of settler colonial misogyny, institutionalized through residential schools and successive Indian Acts, has become so diffuse that it now saturates all our relationships. The misogyny of settler colonial misrecognition through state legislation has functioned so completely, yet subtly, that informs many of our struggles for recognition and liberation. In such context, what does it mean to be held accountable, as my friend and colleague Anishinaabe feminist Dori Nason demands, to our, quote, responsibilities to protect the values and traditions that serve as the foundation for the survival of the land and indigenous peoples? To start, it demands that indigenous people commit ourselves in practice to uprooting the symbolic violence that structures indigenous women's lives as much as we demand in words that the material violence against indigenous women and girls comes to an end. Again, stated clearly, if we fail to address the systemic and symbolic character of the violence indigenous women and girls disproportionately face, decolonization will forever remain a man-made colonial sham. Finally, decolonization beyond the nation-state. Now we're in a position to visit the concern regarding a problematic claim by Anishinaabe political philosopher Dale Turner in this book, This Is Not a Peace Pipe. Turner's claim is that if Indigenous peoples want the political and legal relationship between ourselves and the Canadian state to be informed by and reflect our distinct worldviews, then we will have to, quote, engage the state's legal and political discourses in more effective ways. This form of engagement, I claim, assumes that the structure of domination that frames Indigenous state relations derives its legitimacy and sustenance by excluding Indigenous peoples and voices from the legal and political, institutional, and discursive settings within which our rights are determined. Seen from this light, it would indeed appear to be critically important to undermine colonialism by involving ourselves in more effective ways and participating in the Canadian legal and political practices that determine the meaning of Aboriginal rights. Yet I would venture to suggest that over the last 40 years, Indigenous peoples have become incredibly skilled at participating in Canadian legal and political practices that Turner suggests. In the wake of the 1969 White Paper, these practices emerged as the hegemonic approach to forging change in our political relationship with the Canadian state. We have also seen, however, that our efforts to engage these discursive and institutional spaces to secure recognition of our rights have not only failed, but have instead served to subtly reproduce the forms of racist, sexist, economic, and political configurations of power that we initially sought through our engagements and negotiations with the state to challenge. Why has this been the case? Part of the reason has to do with the sheer magnitude of discursive and non-discursive power we find ourselves up against in our struggle. Subsequently, in our efforts to interpolate the legal and political discourses of the state to secure recognition of our rights to land and self-determination, we have too found ourselves often interpolated as subjects of settler colonial rule. Now, what are the implications of this profound power disparity in our struggles for land and freedom? Does it require that we vacate the field of state negotiations and participation entirely? I don't think so. Settler colonialism has rendered us a minority in our own homelands, and this necessitates that we continue to engage with the state's legal and political system. As Indigenous feminist scholar Sarah Hunt, sitting over there, writes, quote, "Surely we must engage with this powerful system, but appealing to the law alone will not stop the violence from taking place." What our present condition does demand, in my mind, is that we begin to approach our engagements with the state's legal apparatus with a degree of critical self-reflection, skepticism, and caution that has to date been largely absent in our efforts. It also demands that we begin to shift our attention away from the largely rights-based recognition orientation that emerged as hegemonic over the last 4 decades to a resurgent politics of recognition that seeks to practice decolonial, gender emancipatory, and economically non-exploitative alternatives, structures of law and sovereign authority that are grounded in a refashioning of the best of Indigenous legal and political traditions. This shift away from a politics of recognition would even include our having to abandon what has become the near sacrosanct normative core of our theorizations of what a just relationship might look like. The so-called nation-to-nation model built on a framework of mutuality and equality between peoples. Here, the 17th century Haudenosaunee-Tuvro Wampum Treaty with the Dutch often stands in as the paradigmatic model of this normative relationship, depicting 2 vessels, a ship and an Indian canoe, traveling down a river in parallel and respecting each other's autonomy, with each boat never attempting to steer or control the destiny of the other. The problem with these nation-to-nation frameworks, at least when applied to contemporary power relationships that we face today, is that they assume a moral equivalency between the colonizer and the colonized. A moral equivalency that doesn't exist. They also assume the legitimacy of the ship-of-state's economic, legal, and political institutions that have all but destroyed the river and eroded the river banks that we are supposed to peacefully navigate together with respect and in autonomy. Under such conditions, recognizing the legitimacy of the colonial ship of state's right of travel is an impossibility, and we need to start orienting our struggles towards a decidedly different end. Decolonization, as I have now come to understand it and starting to frame more in my work, demands that we capsize and sink that fucking ship. We need to put that ship at the bottom of the river. Thank you.
All right, thank you. That was fantastic. We're going to open this up to questions now. We have, let's see, what do we have? So probably about half an hour or 40 minutes at this point. So I'll take a few questions. We'll give Glenn a chance to answer, and then we'll move back to the crowd. So is there anyone dying to jump in right now?
Before we get in, we've got some cushions. Do people want to sit up front on cushions? Yeah? So if you want, I'll bring some cushions out there about 20. Make your way up there and we'll have cushions.
All right, do I have any questions from the audience right now? Yes, okay. Can I ask also that you introduce yourself before asking your question?
Sure. My name is Dorian. Hi. I was wondering if you could speak about the introduction to or the foreword to your book and the thinking behind it. I'm not sure if that's read it.
Yeah, well, it kind of relates to the title and to the role that Colonial plays in it. So I had a really nice student title, and the publisher said that I had to change it for marketing purposes. And the title was just based on some of the dissertation work that I had done. And as I came to write the book, it became more and more Fanonian text, especially when I added the chapter on resentment and the role played by emotions in decolonial politics, which I also drew significantly off of Fanon's work. So when I was trying to think of titles, they sent out an alternative, and it was way worse than mine. So bad that I couldn't actually live with it being published under it. I won't mention the name, but and they were like, you need something punchy and provocative and whatever. And then I was like, well, how about I just call it Red Skin White Mask then? Kind of thinking that it was just arrogant and inappropriate. And they're like, okay, we'll do that. And then when I asked my mentor and friend and teacher, Ty Galford, if he would do me the honor of writing an introduction, he agreed to. And it was taking him so long, and the publisher was getting on me and getting on me and getting on me, and I was like, just give me the goddamn introduction. Like, it doesn't have to be long, just a couple of pages. And he's just like, wait, man, I got this down. I just need a couple more days. And then he produced this introduction, which is, for those who are familiar with Fanon's work, it's emulating the voice of Jean-Paul Sartre's introduction to The Wretched of the Earth. And he's like, is it over the top? I was like, yeah, but it's awesome. So,
Great. Anyone else right now?
Yeah. Sorry, I'll try to have my voice carry. My name is Eva. I'm a graduate student at York University. I was wondering, when you were talking about kind of how we should view power in the settler colonial situation, you mentioned that it was useful to draw on Foucault's idea of governmentality, right? And from my understanding, the way that he theorizes that, or analyzes it, whatever you want to take it, is that there's actually not, he's very against the idea of there being a state, but really focused on talking about that the state has techniques and technologies for ensuring that certain things happen. So I'm just wondering, because then you were also really strongly talking about how this is a structure, and the structure is about material relations. So I'm just wondering what is it gained to focus on an idea of governmentality that draws our attention away from the state as a political and legal apparatus?
yeah, I don't really draw off of Foucault all that much. I think there's insights in Foucault's notion of governmentality, but insights that would push that the state is like the kind of coercive disciplinary apparatus of the state always simultaneously exists along with these more kind of subtle forms of rule that are negotiated through rather than totally against freedom. And so I felt that's what I actually think that Fanon's so insightful for, because the crushing materiality of violent power is always there, but so is the less bloody form of subjection that occurs through relationships of recognition, where the structure is managed kind of at a distance by producing certain forms of identity. So I actually don't draw off of Foucault. At best, I would draw off of people that have attempted to apply the kind of governmentality thesis to colonial situations. So David Scott's one person, even though I disagree with lots of what he says about Fanon. But I think that actually that's a form of kind of governmentality that doesn't eschew the kind of coercive and violent nature of the colonial state and the material relationships of colonialism, but yet still sheds that insight on how relationships can be governed through the production of certain identities, which even absent that violence, we would still conduct our lives in colonial ways that reproduces relationships.
Any other questions right now? If there are none right now, I'm going to jump in. So, okay, over there. Yeah.
Just to follow what she was saying, the notion of the idea that the way that we structure the colonial, the settler colonized relationship is rude as opposed to kind of dominating. I'm wondering if you just talk for a minute about sort of because for what it does for me is it really problematizes the sort of the story of colonization as a job to be finished, and that it maintains the subject of the colonized as part of like a mechanism that becomes really inextricably linked to the state, and kind of sort of produces a very asymptotic sort of relationship in which you always produce the sort of approach the end, but by virtue of the sort of function of the colonized, you're always sort of bending upwards towards some sort of mechanism which continues to define the axes. And I'm just wondering if you could, for a minute talk about the relationship of, especially indigenous peoples in Canada as part of something which is sort of reconstituted of the state, but also kind of necessary for the state.
I think that a certain indigenous subject is necessary for the state, but I think that the notion of like what we might call like a resurgence or like a resurgent indigenous identity can't be necessary for the state. It's its fundamental negation and threat.
Sorry, I mean indigenous populations as defined by the state, not as some external sort of.
So yeah, like constitutional, like Aboriginal, Native, or First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. I'd have to think about that one for a little bit. It's probably the first question I've never had, and like all the questions tend to be fairly specific, but I would have to think about that. So when it snaps in my brain, I'll get back to you.
So we'll take some other questions and then come back. So I had a hand over here.
My name is Mayana. I'm a grad student at U of T. I have a question which is maybe more specific. I'm interested in this distinction between the kind of radical action and not. I think of this partly because I attended the TRC, the last one in Edmonton, and on the last day of the TRC, the commissioners kind of, there was this big thing with the Governor General and everything, and then at the very end they led everyone out of the conference center, and out at the front was a couple trucks led by a few of the I Know No More female leaders, and a lot of the people, most of the people who were there then joined in a march, and there was a march through the city kind of thing. And I'm wondering about, it made me realize that the people who are involved in the TRC, problematic in all the ways that are obvious, they're also sometimes in certain situations the same people who are involved in the more radical actions. And so I wonder about, how do we distinguish between those things, and whether there are some dangers, especially for those of us who are not involved, making that distinction.
Yeah, no, I think you outlined just the truth, and it strikes at the core of the political and perspective diversity that our communities kind of embody. And I wouldn't say and again in the book I kind of parse out what we mean by reconciliation, in relationship to who's uttering it or where the source of the meaning of reconciliation comes from. And I'm not against reconciliation, and there's three senses that I kind of see this happening. One is a reconciliation with a damaged self that has been subject to structural and symbolic violence. So Indigenous peoples will often speak of reconciliation in this individual or collective as a form of healing, and you'd have to be just inhuman to not recognize the importance of that process after what our communities have gone through, especially through residential school and stuff like that. And then there's reconciliation in a political sense, which is usually talked about the reconciliation between two conflicting parties, and this is where the treaty relationship or fixing that damaged and now violent relationship, and I actually think that there's something to that form of reconciliation. And then there's the state's form of reconciliation, which is top down. It's about maintaining economic certainty, in order to facilitate development and settlement on land. It's about making a distinct and sharp break from the past by like obscuring what is actually being reconciled here. That's why residential schools are easy in a reconciliation sort of discourse, because they're no longer in existence. Now all we have is the legacy that we need to overcome so that we can all move on what Harper in his, at the end of his apology unapologetically stated to be now our land, like everyone's. So it serves that kind of ideological sort of neo-colonial function. So what we need to do is, rather than be like, who are the subjects here that are either for a process or against a process, it's like what are the forms of reconciliation that underpin their aspiration and actions. And I think they'll usually, from Indigenous peoples, even those who attend the TRC, tend to be number 1 and 2, and still would be very critical, although recognize some importance to healing and so on that might be offered through attending one of the events. Like I went to the event, I went with like a number of people who were simultaneously critical and quite concerned about what they saw there, but still recognized it as being significant in many people's lives. So it's just not like I guess that would be my answer.
I wanted to ask you, so in your analysis, who is the main antagonist? Is it the Canadian state, or is it the Canadian society larger than the state?
Again, it depends. The state is a significant antagonist in this relationship, and I don't think that can actually be recovered. But significant amounts of like the dominant society are too, who have, like I said, who have really, like even in expressions of solidarity, for example, that happened around Idle No More, the bulk of solidarity, which was and I don't even know if that's the term to use, that was expressed by non-Indigenous Canadians around Idle No More, was pretty wishy-washy, weak, and instrumental. It was a solidarity that was ultimately, again, piggybacking on some political gains that Indigenous organizers had made in challenging Harper on certain environmental issues, which is what most people got behind, because their interests, i.e. protection of lakes and rivers, happened to align with Indigenous interests who were making gains in publicizing that in pretty effective ways. Now, that sort of solidarity would be withdrawn, for instance, if an Indigenous community decided to do something that didn't mix well or resonate well with that largely white environmental sort of ethic. That's not solidarity in the sense that I think we ought to conceive of it. So in that sense, I think that even when, and that we had the most support in terms of movement by non-Canadians that we ever had in history, it was still started largely instrumental and weak in nature. And like I said in like the thesis on direct action, this isn't going to be an easy process, and I expect non-native people to fight back with quite a degree of assertive and even ferociousness, because the demands that are being placed, the demands that are placed on everybody by decolonizing in an authentic and real way, means that a lot of feelings are going to be hurt, and a lot of people's power and privilege is going to be challenged, and if correctly played out, ripped from under them. It's not a matter of like, and this is the problem with the Paul Martins and all, and the main problem is that there's this closing the gap idea is that Indigenous peoples need to be brought up to a level that many Canadians live at, and that just seems to be entirely, it needs to be flipped over the head, is that most of Canadian society needs to be torn down to a sustainable way of relating to each other in the world, rather than raising us up to what is a just pathologically destructive and unsustainable way of life. So
Hi, my name is Michelle. I'm in the Bachelor Social Work program at York, and I'm just learning a lot about these concepts and different issues. And thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you could, going along with that last question, and using I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, the wampum belt analogy, and how it's like, with the two nations and the Canadian ship, and how that ship needs to be destroyed, and kind of like how you were talking about taking, like, basically the power away. And can you explain more about some ways that we can beat this, like, unfair, capitalistic, like, crazy society in Canada?
So good question. How to beat capitalism?
So, can you elaborate on how to fix all this? I'll nerd out a little bit and just talk about the treaty idea that I kind of polemically, but ended with. It's just that the idea that we can live in a relationship of mutual equality, has tended to be liberalized in a way that we would already be at a loss. We would kind of just sediment a structure of domination that I don't think that we just have to think beyond. When treaties were when that paradigmatic expression of treaty and relational autonomy was articulated, Indigenous peoples were far more powerful. It was compelled that that you could establish a relationship of peace that was compelled by both people's positions and the relative relations of power and interdependence that they had. So you could conceivably be traveling in an autonomous, respectful, peaceful sort of way. But what happens when one partner in the relationship has now come to viciously dominate the entire field, like the whole space of this kind of the geography of this space in which we're supposed to relate to each other in more equitable and respectful terms? And what happens when that entity that you're supposed to be relating with is perhaps incapable, it's inbuilt, that they cannot respect the autonomy of another because of its economy, because of its political form, because of all these sorts of things? Then you now have to abandon the idea that you can relate with that vicious, in the words of my supervisor's new work, vicious social system, cannot accommodate and relate to a virtuous one. And therefore we need to kind of think more about what the implication of that is. And it means that partnership needs to be destroyed. Now, in a Fanonian sense, that destruction would come through quite drastic ways. It would have to be blown to smithereens through armed conflict and war and this sort of thing. I'm not suggesting that that's the path that we ought to take, but it needs to be destroyed in a structural sense, in that I don't think that we can actually have a relationship with the state. I think the state, and I think Kropotkin's right, is an inherently colonial. It is premised on dispossession. It is premised on the kind of incorporation of previously self-sufficient, autonomous communities and lives into the structure of Leviathan. And the capitalist economy obviously cannot accommodate. It is an inherently predatory and expansionary. So how are you supposed to relate with it? So now this isn't answering your question. Well, what's the alternative then? Because I think that there isn't an alternative. There's going to be alternatives and a kind of a hegemony of relationships between that are always going to be between different disparate communities that are engaging in these struggles together. But even then, I tend to kind of focus in the here and now on practices that I think need to be highlighted as really potentially making making these changes on the ground in the here and now, and how can we have those proliferate in more effective ways.
I'm just thinking about the rights of the Mother Earth.
Could you ask louder, please?
I'm just thinking about the rights of the Mother Earth that Evo Morales instigated constitutional reform in Bolivia, and how it links to Amishkobe or many other national nation non-text oral traditions. I'm not sure. I'm wondering, does it make sense to try to transport this model into this part of Turtle Island, or does it make sense to, like, where are those texts? That, where do they exist? How close are they to becoming forms that we can use and that especially settlers can use to support the rights of specific forms, rivers, mountains, forests, as well as species?
This is not going to be a good answer because I made it a rule of mine not to answer questions that I don't know anything really about the context, or whether there's like Todd or a number of people who could speak to the Bolivian example more. So I don't know whether or not, I don't know it well enough to be able to say or how effective it would be if we kind of adopted a like model here. So I'm just not sure. I have an answer to the question.
Oh, let's go to that, and then we'll have a hand over there.
It's constituent of the state because I think, and just as an example, when there was an attempt to bring the Constitution home in 1982 and 1981, that, which was often even perceived as an anti-colonial move, like the separation of the formal legal separation of Canada from the Commonwealth by kind of developing its legitimacy of its own sovereignty by adopting a constitution and so on. Indigenous people, the construction of Aboriginal peoples who had constitutional rights was quite crucial in that. It was part, like, in order to maintain that kind of active colonial statecraft, which was being portrayed and posited by state crafters as a form of decolonization themselves, had to position themselves in an awkward way that recognized Indigenous peoples through the creation of this constitutional category of Métis, Aboriginal, or Métis, Indian, and Inuit. So it was interesting that moment of Canada's kind of assertion of its colonial sovereignty could only occur if it could kind of manage the problematic other that Indigenous nationhood represented through incorporating it within its own newfound constitution.
Scano, my name's Terry Monteor. I'm from Six Nations of the Grand River, and I'm very interested in your idea that we should still negotiate, given the viciousness of a settler state that actually wants to remove our title and our rights inherently from the land. The example being given Caledonia, where we are sort of in a process of negotiating with the federal government, who are saying take it or leave it. And when they say take it or leave it, they're saying you give up the title, you get the money. We're not interested in that, so why should we even bother in a process that's not going to get us where we need to be?
Yeah, no, I would agree. But what I was saying is, in certain contexts, we will have to engage the legal apparatus of the state. Whether it's on a larger scale question over land rights and title is different than saying, like, we might have to we might, in this instance, call the cops, even, in a domestic violence case. We just need to be able to think more strategically about what our short-term efforts will do when we involve the surveillance and repressive apparatus of the state in our lives, and when we're going to push back and reject it. I just have been challenged too many times on this kind of absolute withdrawal, turn away, based on actually a position of privilege. Like, well, what if the bulldozers are at our communities, or are at the reserve boundaries, we may try and stop them through by like applying for an injunction or whatever the hell the legal terminology is, as one of many sort of attempts to stop that encroachment onto our territories. Now, the likelihood of that happening, who knows what it is, it's tended to not go in our favor, so that's when we might end up like putting bodies on the line, sort of thing. So I'm not saying like actually over questions of land, like through the comprehensive land claims process, which my community has dealt with, and a lot of First Nations in British Columbia have dealt with. I actually think that there's been no, like, it has ended up being like a bigger trap than it has produced any kind of alternative outcomes that might resemble decolonization. So I actually agree with you.
Okay, I have a hand in the back there, and then I'm going to put myself in the queue and abuse my access to the microphone as well.
I really appreciate your critique of the liberal forms.
Could you speak up a little bit? Sorry.
I really appreciate your critique of liberal forms of recognition, and I'm wondering if you can talk more about it in relation to the TRC. And my question really is more, from my understanding, the TRC is modeled after the South African model, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And from what I remember reading about it in undergrad, is that a lot of the Black South Africans actually insisted that the sort of return of like the material remains, or even like the remains of the body, was more important than sort of this like confessional that the TRC became. And so how does liberal forms of recognition work as kind of confessions of guilt, and what does that mean if most Canadians don't actually feel guilty about being suffered?
So the TRC's objective is to kind of inaugurate some sort of process of reconciliation. And since 1969, but accelerated after 1996, the means to achieving that end of reconciliation has been through forms of recognition, whether it's through land, economic development, self-government, or through recognition of the harms of the past in order to overcome the legacy of that is like kind of saddled our present. So recognition and reconciliation are always like once the stated end, and recognition of various forms is the means. Now, I don't deal with the settler guilt stuff and kind of how this spectacle is supposed to assuage this subject position, but what I do show is how reconciliation, as it's understood by the state and mandated through the TRC, requires the fabrication of this break in history that relegates all of colonial, like if it even mentions colonization, which it doesn't, but the first gesture of reconciliation did in response to the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples, has to be relegated to like the dustbins of history, and then what we're dealing with is just the like what I refer to as the affective residue of that history. So the pain, the anger, the resentment, all this stuff that characterize Indigenous peoples as these wounded subjects that just can't move on. So reconciliation is supposed to facilitate that moving on. It's got a very temporal move to it. Like, how do we get over the past? How can we inaugurate healing and closure so Indigenous peoples can get over the past? Now, not being able to get over the past is one definition of resentment, which I characterize as a form of politicized anger. It's an unwillingness to forgive. And I'm saying, actually, it's that the reconciliation process, that explosive unwillingness to get over the past that was fueled by this sort of politicized anger that is resentment, that the reconciliation process came in the 90s to pacify, because that explosive resentment expressed by Indigenous people's anti-colonial sort of anger was resulting in two things in the 1980s and 90s. It was resulting in an escalation of direct action that was profoundly economically disruptive. So you had all over Canada during the 80s, like you had the Lubicon, you had the Algonquins, you had like the Innu, you had You had First Nations all across British Columbia. You had the Mohawks who were taking this to the land. And there was a general sense that this was going to result, there was going to be a breakdown in Indigenous peoples not willing to play by the game and respect Canada's claim and sole monopoly, legitimate monopoly on the use of political violence. And then what happened? You had Oka happen. So you have two things that tend to happen in contexts where reconciliation mechanisms are implemented. You have the potential of a bloodbath, and then you have divestment and capital flight, or like a disruption to the economy. Now in Canada that was more diffuse, but in the 1980s those two elements were there, and then Oka happened, and then you enter the language of formal reconciliation. Now, to get to the guilt thing, I think that it's the emotional equivalent of, I think, what Indigenous resentment would be, because it usually gets targeted in quite a negative light. It's pacifying, it's kind of, you can't get over it, it's non-active, it's reactive. This is usually how guilt and shame get characterized in some of the literature on the politics of emotions. But it can also have a transformative effect, I think, in the way that Indigenous people's resentment can. It can be a mobilizer. It can kind of be the sign of an effective indicator of some sort of harm or more wrongdoing. And I think that that from the perspective of Indigenous peoples, to be dealing with somebody in some attempt to reestablish a just relationship, to have somebody who feels guilt and shame is an important first step. It's just how do you and where do you go with it? Because to speak with like an absolutely unrepentant colonizer is a really difficult and annoying thing to have to do. So I think that that guilt can be an important trigger. But you're right, in the TRC, the way that, even just in my own experience of it, how I saw it play out, it didn't, or it has yet to, and then we can question whether or not it will, amount to that sort of transformation in the subjectivities of settler populations. Because a lot of what I saw was kind of like a one-off deal. You showed up. In the case of Vancouver, you bought your hot dog and your popcorn, you listen to some pretty horrific confessions, and then you walk away thinking that you did good that day, and then business went on as usual. So.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in with a handful of questions that I have. So the first is whether or not we can return to this question of the politics of recognition and what you see as perhaps stimulating that emergence. And a couple of the ideas that I've toyed with myself, and I'm not sure if you can speak to, would be perhaps one, changes in the settler states' attitudes toward the labor and capacity of Indigenous bodies and towards Indigenous labor. So settler colonialism in the first instance, I think, required that the settler negate the labor and capacity of the Indigenous body. And have there been transformations in that attitude that have led to this politics of recognition to emerge? In the kind of late 60s, early 70s. The second thing that I think about sometimes is changes in the ideal liberal subject, and if transformations in liberal subjectivity, according to changing dynamics of accumulation, have anything to do with this emergence of recognition-based politics. The second question I wonder is, when we think of the politics of recognition, do we see this as a continuation of a certain process of elimination, in so much as recognition is, there are a number of other groups that gain official recognition through the Canadian state, and so Indigenous peoples are no longer Indigenous, and in terms of their relationship to the land, that is no longer prioritized, but they're lumped in with other minority groups who are accorded statuses of recognition. So, in so much as that maybe is the case, do we see this as a continuation of various means of elimination? My final question, which I kind of spoke to you about earlier on, I said I was going to use this mic, which is following on that note, There are a number of other groups that are brought into this politics of recognition, among which could be, certain minority immigrant populations, racialized migrants, who in many ways are a second side of the settler-colonial relation. And so, do you find that there is any utility, or is there any place in strategizing along with racialized migrant workers in terms of this process of decolonization? Is there anything to be done there?
Okay, first question. Yes. Insofar as recognition has emerged as a way to secure the state's ongoing access to indigenous lands and resources, following certain kind of political and legal changes and mobilizations of First Nations themselves in the 50s and 60s into the 70s. I think that land was central in that, but increasingly has become more about also gaining access to indigenous people's laboring bodies. But I actually think that was kind of always the case. It's just well, this is really what we need right now. But yet residential schools trying to indoctrinate indigenous folks into internalizing the kind of ethics of menial wage labor. So it was always there, but it was just more of a long-term project. It was part of the civilizing discourse that viewed certain forms of work as more civilized than others. So as part of this also this racial story that was unfolding. But they were needed in the here and now. They had plenty of other people doing the important work, especially after the decline of the fur trade and where we moved to a political economy that wasn't based on the labor of indigenous people. So yeah, I think that it's always there. It's just a matter of it depends on a shifting matter of priority. It's probably there more than ever now because of the proximity of indigenous bodies to these extractivist industries that Canada is so dependent on. Third question, yeah, of course we should be struggling together. I think that the networks and relationships of struggle we need to all work hard on. But what we can't do is we can't toe a line that accuses neo-racist indigenous nationalists as somehow being the new boss in enclosures because we're making some sort of moral, legal, political claim to land. What those ridiculous positions take on who claim that indigenous peoples are conflating migration with colonization, other than by just cherry picking certain problematic people within our communities as saying it in such and such a forum, is that that those relationships that kind of to account for dispossession or to correct dispossession is often based on an understanding of relationship with territory, which often also involves relationships with others and their rights to share that land. So I think that that has to be taken seriously. Is that decolonization will require a recognition of indigenous people's relationships with our homelands, and it is those relationships that embody that sort of relationality that actually fuels and informs an alternative ethics of how we would relate to one another. So it's not by eschewing indigenous claims to land, by claiming that they're somehow exclusionary and racist, but it's actually living through those relationships of indigenous peoples to land that we might be able to think of a better way to relate with each other and the land itself. Second one?
Elimination.
Yeah, it's about elimination. The structure, like settler colonialism, has a structure where it violently and symbolically transforms outsiders into insiders. So the whole idea of the frontier. It's the transformation of the outside native into the colonized subject citizen. Now it's, or just eliminate them physically. So now that kind of that settler colonial move to incorporate and kind of expansively incorporate and turn problematic indigenous others into like loyal subject citizens is done through recognition rather than entirely done through just force and violence and physical elimination.
Hi, my name is Carl. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to maybe the relationship between on this one side, like over half of Indigenous folks are living in urban spaces and indeed like urban reserves. And on the other hand, the importance of this idea like returning to the land and sort of kind of like I'm trying to find like a bridge maybe to this gap, or I don't know if it's a gap, but like what does the decolonizing activity look like in urban spaces if it does at all?
That's a challenging one. And then again, I rely on others who are doing that decolonizing work in urban spaces. So there was a thing recently that was kind of exploded a bit within my rather small circle of Facebook friends on the assertion of Indigenous place names and so on. I think it's here in Toronto, which reconnects that presence of that sovereign presence within Indigenous space. Now, for some, they might just say that that's kind of a symbolic, kind of cute gesture, but like, it's, for Indigenous peoples, it's way more substantive, and it's about reconnecting with those histories and so on that inform our philosophies and our ethics and fuel the demand to kick this whole colonial enterprise over. It's also, I think, it can be very subversive for non-Indigenous folks and Indigenous folks because of this, the significance of the role of signage and so on as just kind of an arbitrary, it's like just kind of source of authority. We don't even think about signs, but they make us stop. They make us do a whole bunch of stuff that we just kind of follow. So it can also have that sort of more playful, symbolic, subversive aspect. But there's also other things, like there's physical reclamations of urban space. So in Vancouver, there was the reclamation of Oppenheimer Park by homeless and people who have been displaced. And in the downtown east side, at least, there's an overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples who inhabit that space. So it can also be the tent city that happened in response to gentrification and displacement associated with the gong show of the 2010 Olympics was a reclamation of Indigenous land and space in the city. So these things are constantly happening and are constantly being enacted by Indigenous communities and people in urban spaces. And again, like we just need to support those struggles and see them proliferate and take root and so on. And depending on what city you're talking about is important too. So my First Nation is trying to make a claim for a good chunk of Yellowknife. It's attempting to do it through negotiated means, so I'm pretty suspect of whether or how that will play out. But there's like, just as the kind of, this is on the radar, and these are within Indigenous people's sights in ways that they haven't been, because I was talking to Tony Alfred when I was in Victoria a couple of weeks, and he said for a long time we kind of just gave up on cities. We thought, it's hopeless, man. The white people have it. Let's focus on homelands and these other things, but that seems to be insufficient. Indigenous city, urban space is Indigenous lands. It's sovereign, and we cannot give up on it, and we need to decolonize it as well.
I just had a question. So you are referring a lot to the settler colonial situation, and I'm just wondering, what is gained when you use the term settler colonialism over the term colonialism? And I'm thinking in particular of Homi Bhabha's reading of Fanon, where he questions what is behind this desire to give the settlement a state of preeminence in our theoretical
settlement or the settler?
The settlement, right? So why is the settlement now considered to be a more valid site of analysis than we would then perhaps the colony? I'm just wondering why that seems to be so predominant in your work.
Well, part of it is because I do actually think that there's different kinds of colonial social formations, and settler colonial is one of them, where settlement has come to overwhelm in massive amounts the indigenous minority. The entire kind of state itself has come to encase and is premised on the destruction of previously self-determining indigenous nations. And that necessitates a different way of how we think about decolonization, because you can't just either through war kill the colonizers or kick them out. That's just not an option. But I do find it problematic sometimes in the way in which settler colonial studies, for example, is not necessarily privileging settlement, which I think is a really important problem to come to grips with as a form of relatively resistant and sedimented power, but which has come to privilege the settler once again. It's kind of like settler colonial studies there's this, I worry that it might go the way of white studies, and that it just provides another academic discourse in which settlers get to talk about themselves, even if they're marginally kind of recognizing that they're a problem. So there's not, I think, I actually do, it's like, might be funny, but I think it has a way of, these kind of changes in discourse, especially in the academy, can emerge with a transformative thrust and then sediment into kind of a form of conservatism where the discourse itself no longer is transformative effective. It becomes stale and problematic. So.
Great, and I saw him over there.
My name is Ramona, and I'm a graduate student at U of T. I'm originally from Colonial and Carolina territories, which is now known as Texas, and I'm from where Keystone wants to dig up my ancestors for the pipeline. Anyway, so I live here in Toronto now, and I've been here since 2001, and I'm trying to tease out what Indigenous governance would look like in the urban context. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what that might look like.
Well, again, I think it depends on what you mean by governance, because there's in certain urban centers, there's an attempt to think through what urban self-government might look like.
No, because I agree with you that self-government seems to be a trap. And looking at land claims and self-government agreements, they open the way for the nation state to still have some sort of ministerial sign-off on whatever, even like the land and water boards come up with.
Well, I don't I would again, I just fall back on trying to look at hopeful examples of where an indigenous practice of governance is actually attentive to the destructiveness of the social relations that they're attempting to kind of address. So would we consider, for example, the network of organization and activists undertaken in Vancouver in order to hold the Memorial March every year to honor murdered and missing women and loved ones. I think that's probably a really good example of not just a politics, but a form of governance that is undertaken by a diversity of Indigenous women in organizations and networks that is attempting to address the kind of the heteropatriarchal violence of settler colonialism through organizing and through their political work. And it's happening like in that context, it's happening in the city. So that would be a good example in a Fanonian way, even like where these acts of self-empowerment and organizing, often grounding in the local kind of cultures and of the Indigenous people and organizing that are doing that, which is also aimed at transforming a structure of domination of sexual violence and so on. The problem is that you don't tend to think of that as, like, we barely think about that as political work in our kind of sexist brains, let alone like an actual form of self-determination and governance. And that needs to be challenged.
All right, so I think we have time for one more question if we have that. Otherwise, we'll start to slowly wrap up. Okay, over there.
I guess I had a couple questions. One, I guess the lady just asked about Indigenous government in the city, right?
Governance.
Governance. Oh, okay. Okay. Well, and I was just wondering why patriarchy is automatically why automatically go the gender route when we're talking about Indigenous community that involves a man and a woman and a family, right? Like sorry, I don't know if I'm expressing myself correctly here, but it seemed like instead of like what talking about Indigenous governance or it was governance. It wasn't government. It was governance. Sorry, maybe I misheard that. But I totally misheard that.
Yeah, and I think I'm failing to understand your question.
Okay, that's fine. Well, government and governance are two very different words, right? But I have another question that hopefully I can communicate properly. And it was in regards to this gentleman over here. He asked a question, and then you responded, and you were talking about some sort of organization called the TRC or the TCR. That's
Truth and Reconciliation.
Okay, yeah, the Truth and Reconciliation. All right. And how you were talking about the pacification of Indigenous resentment. And I was wondering if the pacification of Indigenous resentment, is that something that benefits Indigenous people, or is that something that benefits the state in particular? And also too, how do you think that we understand that resentment? Do you think that we put it in a negative light, or do you think that we understand it as a motivating force?
I think that the discourse of reconciliation really goes a long way to attempt to construct it in a negative light, unless it's actually kind of built into the definition. Because one of the ways in which you reach reconciliation is through forgiveness. And forgiveness by definition is, or by one definition at least, is the willful negation or giving up of one's resentment. So they're very tied conceptually and philosophically close. And then you can look at kind of anger, resentment, and these sorts of things are really pathologized within the discourse of reconciliation too. So the dominant approach is to treat them as unhealthy, retrograde, pathological, destructive, all these sorts of things, which they can. But even in that case, then what we ought to be doing is concerning ourselves, what is the source, what is the structural referent that is producing these effective kind of results. And at that level, the TRC is just inadequate and inequipped to deal with even that. So if they do want to heal Indigenous peoples from their kind of in its more debilitating forms, their resentment, anger, pain, all these sorts of negative expressions of emotion and so on, then at least we ought to talk about the problem, and the problem is ongoing violent dispossession from our territories, usurpation of our sovereignty, which has rendered us dependent, and so on, none of which the TRC has the mandate to address.
Great, thank you. And so we're going to give the last question of the evening to our lovely host, Robert, over there, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, just as you are going to abuse the microphone, I'll abuse the space. I wanted to say that we've spoken about reconciliation as a concept. We've spoken about recognition, but neither one of those is entirely satisfactory. And so, to me, it has to be an element of restorative justice. And so, what might that look like in your eyes, in your analysis, for it to have real substance and significance? Because I think anything less is just playing, footsie with history and with people's emotions and their legacies and their heritage.
It will involve, or have to involve, as a very basic, a return of significant amounts of Indigenous peoples' lands and recognizing our authority over those lands. And the problem is that we've attempted to, we thought that we could get that by asking Canada for it. And so now we need support in taking it back.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Glenn, for your great talk. So we do need to start packing up the space, but I'll remind you that we can continue the conversation if you'd like to at the Paupers Club. Just again, ask them for the reservation made for the book launch. There are some tables set aside. Thank you, guys.